Hello, and welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Our topic today is honeybees, and with us is Dr. Robyn Underwood, an apiculture educator from Penn State Cooperative Extension. Hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
I am an insect lover, especially honeybees, and I've been studying them for more than 25 years. I just think they're fascinating, and I hope you will too. I've been a professor, but currently I'm an extension educator, which means that I just get to talk about honeybees all the time, and it's super fun.
That's great. Well, honeybees have been valued as an essential pollinator for agriculture crops. But in the past decade, many people living in suburban and urban areas have expressed an interest in beekeeping. What do you think is behind this trend of beekeeping in cities and backyards?
I think that people are realizing what a fun and relaxing hobby it can be for them, and they get the reward of honey at the end. I think COVID-19 had a lot to do with it when people started gardening for themselves and like getting into homesteading and things like that. So beekeeping really fit into that. Yeah, it's very popular.
That's true. That would kind of coordinate with the people were growing their own food, and then you could also do the beekeeping and have some honey as a benefit. Well, we appreciate you being with us today to tell us more about honeybees. So while you begin to share your presentation, let me remind our audience that if anyone has a question about today's topic, please type it into the Q&A and we will get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. So Dr. Underwood, whenever you are ready, you can begin.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about honeybees today. I could talk for about 20 hours, but I only have 20 minutes, so I'll give you a little flavor of the super interesting things that honeybees do. So if you found bees in nature, you would find them living in some sort of cavity. Often that is a cavity that was previously made by a woodpecker, and the only entrance to that hive would be a small hole in a tree. If you cut that tree open, what you would see is that bees build parallel combs. So here on the right, you can see the parallel combs, honeycombs built by the bees in the tree. But keeping bees like this is not very convenient for us humans. It's not a very fun hobby to just watch bees fly in and out of a hole. We want to get in and see what's going on. So back in about 1850, a Philadelphian, Lorenzo Langstroth, patented this hive configuration that we still use today, where there are movable frames for the beekeeper. And there's many reasons that we need this. First of all, we can check on what's going on with the queen. Very importantly, we must be able to check for diseases. You might not realize that honeybees have parasites, bacterial infections, viruses that we need to keep track of and do something about sometimes. And also it allows us to have interchangeable parts and be able to remove excess honey for our own use. So these are really how most bees are kept. And so if you became a beekeeper, you would have a couple of these maybe in your backyard. You can paint them fun colors and things like that. So this is me working with my bees. You can see in the top right picture that I have this tool in my hand. It's called a hive tool. Really, the bees glue everything together, so you must have a tool for prying apart the frames so you can lift them out. And you might also notice that there are bees all over the frames. Some people that come to visit are surprised that the bees don't just fly off, right? So they just hang out on the frames because they're protecting their resources and they're taking care of their babies on those frames. So if you got really close to those frames, you would see that they are made up of wax, and we give them a wooden frame. That's for our convenience. They don't really need that. But this is where the classic hexagon shape that is associated with bees comes from, because all of the surfaces inside of the hive on those frames are made up of wax hexagons. Those hexagons do everything. They store nectar, which gets made into honey. They are storage spaces for pollen. And one baby bee can be developed in each cell over and over and over. So it's like a crib for the babies as well. So critical to their life is these hexagons. So if you looked in the honeybee hive, which is the equipment or the space, you would find a colony of honeybees. And there are many members of that colony. First of all, there's one queen. She is, there can only be one. If there's two, they generally fight to the death so that only one is left. There are mostly workers. So you can see here tens of thousands of workers. Maybe in spring there's 20,000. Maybe later in the summer there's 40,000 or 60,000 in one colony. And then there are the drones. There's hundreds of drones at some times of the year. So you might notice on my table here that queens and workers are both females, and they're both come from fertilized eggs. So they have the same basic genetics, but what determines which one they turn into is what they're fed as they're developing. Queens get what's called royal jelly their whole life developing, and copious amounts of it. Workers get that too, but only for half of their life as a larva, and the other half they get mixed in plant parts, meaning pollen. And that actually changes the trajectory of their development, so they become a worker instead of a queen. And then we have the drones. These are the males. They are complete. They come from an egg that has not been fertilized. So the drone has a mom, but not a dad, although he does have a grandfather. So think about that. In order to recognize these, if you couldn't tell from the previous slide how to tell them apart, the real critical thing is to look at their face. So here we have workers and queens have very similar faces, kind of like an upside down teardrop shape. And drones have these crazy big eyes that go to the top and touch. So their face is pretty much a circle. So if you're looking at an observation hive, say at a fair, if the face is a circle, it's not a queen, even though it's a bee that looks bigger than a worker. So we're going to start by talking about the queen. The queen is the mother of everyone in the colony. And you can see that her abdomen, which is the third part of her body, so we have head, thorax, and abdomen, is quite long and fat, and it's pretty much filled with eggs. She lays egg after egg after egg all day long. It's almost all she does. She doesn't even leave the hive to go to the bathroom. She doesn't have to feed herself. All of that work is done by the workers, which you can see in this picture, are taking really good care of her. One of the things that they're getting from her is, of course, maintaining the colony, but she gives off some chemical pheromones, which are like perfume, that impact the behavior and the bodies of the workers. So the ones that are near her will lick her and get some of those pheromones, and then they pass it all throughout the hive so that everybody knows that the queen is well, even if they haven't seen her for a long time. They can smell that she's present. And that smell also affects the workers' bodies, because remember, they're females too, but they don't lay any eggs. Really, the queen's pheromones inhibit their ovaries from ever developing. So they don't get to have their own children, but they take really good care of their sisters and brothers. So here you can see some pictures of what it looks like when the queen's laying an egg. So she takes that big abdomen and folds it down deep into the cell. And so this is what the cell looks like if you cut it away. And here she is laying an egg. And she's laying one egg perfectly in the center of the bottom of that cell. And that cell will act as the crib for that immature growing up. And I wanted to make sure you understood the life cycle of a honeybee. You probably understand the life cycle of a butterfly, where they go egg, larva, pupa, adult. And the pupa is sort of that chrysalis stage where they're not eating, they're just kind of turning from a wiggly white worm to an adult insect, which is a super amazing part of their life. Same thing with honeybees. So a honeybee starts off as an egg. After about 3 days, it will hatch and be a larva here, curled in the bottom of the cell, being fed by her sisters. And she'll grow up so big that she can't fit in a circle anymore in the bottom, and she'll have to stretch out. And then I don't know if you can see, but here it gets capped over. So they kind of shut the door on that larva, doesn't need any more food, and it will pupate inside of there, just like the chrysalis of a butterfly, change completely into an adult honeybee, and then chew its way out of that capping and get to work right away. So as you can see here, the queen is very well taken care of. Her chemicals make the other bees sort of respond and take care of her. And sometimes the beekeeper has a little trouble finding her because she hides, but we don't really have to see her to know that she's doing well as long as we see eggs, larvae, and pupae. So then we don't worry. So here's what a drone looks like in real life. You can see his, nice round face, his big eyes. He's quite stout. He's wide compared to the other types of bees, and he has like this little bit of hairs at the back. So that's how you can recognize him. And his job is to mate with queens from other colonies. So remember, he was made from an unfertilized egg from his mother. So he is not the king at all. There's hundreds of them, first of all, and their job is to spread the queen's genetics to other colonies when those queens need to mate. So workers are really the star of the show. I know it's important to talk about pollination. And so you can see here some workers. So workers are fuzzy and yellow and black striped, and they work all the time. They do all the jobs except for egg laying and mating. So anything else you can think about running a household is done by workers. Remember, they're girls, so don't say he when you see a bee on a flower, because they're girls. And a honeybee colony is the ultimate girl power situation where they're really in charge. So what are some of the jobs that a worker has to do? Well, I told you as soon as they chew out of the cell, they're going to get to work right away. And the first thing they're going to do is clean out the cell that they just came out of, shine it up, and prepare it for the next egg. I also mentioned that honeybee larvae are fed by their sisters, and it's not just simply bringing them some honey. It actually is created inside of the worker's body, inside of her head. So on the left here, we have a cutout drawing of a side view of a worker honeybee's head. And at the bottom would be the mouth parts. And you can see that the part in red is a gland called the hypopharyngeal gland. And this is where the larval food is made. So it's kind of like a mother's milk, although in this situation, it's a sister's milk. So this worker has to eat honey and pollen. So honey is the carbohydrate source and pollen is the protein source. And as long as she has good nutrition, she herself will be able to provide good nutrition to her little sisters. And so in this picture at the top, you can see individual worker larvae in the cells, and they look like they're swimming in a liquid. That's literally their food. So the workers come by and they provision the cells with that royal jelly, and those worker larvae, their whole entire job is eat, grow, grow, grow. That's their whole body is made for growing and taking in nutrients, and then becoming a worker to do more work. So in the bottom picture here, you can see a worker sister with her head down in the cell, because remember, this food is coming from her head, which basically comes out of her mouth. So this is a super important job. And the bees that are doing this are called the nurse bees, because they're, provisioning the nursery of the colony. So what you can see here is a frame of brood. So the eggs, larvae, and pupae we call brood. You can see over here in the bottom left that each of these cells is capped over with wax. So underneath those are pupae, one in each. And then it's always covered with bees, covered with her sister bees. Maybe the queen is walking by, maybe there's a few drones, but really the bulk of the colony is workers hanging out on the comb, the wax comb. So you can see brood mostly on here. And then down here, maybe you noticed that there's some yellow. These are the cells that are filled with pollen. They pack it in there, and then they have their protein right nearby, a little pantry right next to the nursery. Another job of the workers, of course, is tending the queen. And I do have a little video. Hopefully it will play well. You can see, you can hear the buzz of the bees, and hopefully you're picking up the queen there. Oh, there she is. And you can see how the workers are reacting to her, and their antennae are going like crazy onto her. That's because of her pheromones. If they approach her face, it might be that they're giving her some food. If they're at the other end, maybe she just went to the bathroom and they're taking it away. They take really good care of her. You might have noticed that this queen doesn't have a dot on her back, but previous pictures have had a dot. Well, you see this yellow dot on here. That is something that the beekeeper will add if the beekeeper wants to. And so you might see it in various different colors depending on what the beekeeper is trying to note there. So some beekeepers use the color of the queen, the paint dot, to indicate how old she is. There's actually a system among beekeepers where if everybody uses the same color in the same year. So this year happens to be red. So most queens that are born this year will be colored red. And then next year it might be white. And then the year after that will be yellow. And it's a 5-year cycle. So if you see that, know that the queen wasn't born with that the beekeeper added that. And what I use is a Sharpie oil-based paint pen to add that to her. So of course, a very important job of honeybee workers is to collect and store nectar. So the jobs that I'm telling you about are going in order over time. So the cleaning of the cells, the feeding of the sisters, all of that is done early on in the life of an adult honeybee, adult worker. Then they become nectar storage bees because the foragers, which are the ones that go out to the flowers, they're the oldest and they're the ones that are bringing the food home. But probably just like when your parents come home with their groceries, I hope you go out and help them carry them in. That's what some of these workers do. They will go to the front door and collect the nectar straight from that forager bee so that they can offload it very quickly and go back out to get some more. So they then carry it to the proper cell and put it in there. So they're storing the nectar. The other thing that happens is nectar is a sugary water from flowers, but it doesn't have very much sugar. It has a lot of water. And they wouldn't be able to store that over the long term because it would get moldy. So what they do is they fan it and dehydrate it down until it's almost all sugar. Honey is really ready when it has 18% water or less. So that's why it's so thick, because it's got so much sugar. It's tastier for us. It also keeps for almost ever because it's such a super saturated sugar solution that like bacteria and fungi can't really grow in it and cause fermentation and all those problems that would happen if it was watery. So that's super interesting thing that they do in the hive. It's a very active process. They're purposefully doing that. When it gets to the right consistency, they'll cap that over with wax, kind of like putting the lid on a jar. Workers also are the ones that build all of that wax comb. So in this picture on the right, I gave them just an empty space with a little bit of a strip to remind them where they should build. And they went ahead, and this is just after a few days, started building those hexagons. You see them? All of that wax comes from the bees themselves. So now you know that worker bees make a mother's milk for their sisters. They also make wax with their body. People cannot make beeswax. Only bees can. So here's the underside of the abdomen of a worker who is creating wax. You can see it down here too. Basically, insects are segmented, and if you went deep inside right here, you would get to a membrane that's kind of like our skin. And there's a gland there that puts out a liquid that they can put over the hard exoskeleton. It will solidify and then become a little wax flake. So these flakes can be picked up by the bee and then brought to their mouth, and they can shape it into that hexagon. Sometimes you see a lot of these on the bottom of the hive because they fell down. We cannot give them beeswax and have them pick it up and create something. They don't do that. It's only when it comes fresh out of their body that they use it to build. So now the bees are getting older and they're moving toward the entrance. Most of this happened just all in the dark in the hive. And so some of the jobs that require going to the entrance are cleaning. So they pick up debris, dead other sisters, whatever needs to get removed from the hive. If you put a piece of paper in there, they will chew it up and carry it out. It's very important to keep your house clean. So there are workers that do that, but they don't go very far from the hive because they're just new to leaving. And so that job is one of the first outside jobs that they do, taking out the trash. Another really important job is maintaining the temperature and humidity inside of the hive. So you can see these bees here at the entrance. They're on what we call the landing board, and they're all sort of in formation and fanning their wings all at once. And what this does is it creates a current inside of the hive so that the air is circulating. And it's kind of like when you turn the fan on when you're too hot. So you'll see the bees doing this, when it's like 90 degrees out, when of course you also want a fan on your face. They're going to be fanning, first of all, to maintain temperature for the babies that are growing in there. And second of all, to help remove the moisture from the honey that they're trying to ripen in the hive. So it's really cool to see them all working together like that. I think that was a video that's not going to play. So all summer long, they're, spring and summer, they're making honey, storing it away, ripening it, collecting pollen so that they have some protein all year long. And then other things try to come and steal it. So there could be honeybees from another colony, or there could be hornets or, a bear. And all that time they have to guard the hive. They have to make sure that they defend their very, very important resources. They can only collect them at a certain time of year, and then they need to have them for the whole entire year. So they can't allow it to be stolen. And so there are guard bees that will stand at the entrance. You can see these right here, all, facing out. And they're watching for things like a hornet that you can see here on the right, or a yellow jacket, or a bumblebee that's trying to come and steal. And so they'll smell every passerby. And if it's another honeybee from their colony, they will recognize their scent and let them through. If it's not, if it's a honeybee from another colony or some kind of intruder, they will bite and pull and sometimes sting that intruder to keep it away. So now that I mentioned a sting, we might as well talk about it. Yes, honeybees sting. Yes, it hurts, but it hurts them more than it hurts us because one sting and they're dead. It's very sad, but if you think about the colony as something like a super organism, so it's like one individual with many moving parts, losing one worker or two isn't really going to hurt the colony, and it could have just made the person or animal run away and never come back. So it's worth the life of that individual. It's called altruism, when you do something for the benefit of everyone that may not benefit you. But they die during the sting because they have barbed stinger. So you can see here at the top, these barbs, kind of like on a fish hook that you might buy. And so this needle goes easily into the skin, but really can't hardly get out. So what happens is the bee tries to get away and pulls, and basically she kind of pulls out her digestive tract. And so she's going to die, but she leaves behind this white thing here. This is the poison sac. And if you ever see something get stung, it'd be better if it wasn't you, maybe a hat. And if you watched that stinger, it would look like a beating heart, because when she tears that off, it triggers muscles that are going to pump and pump and pump. And what that's doing is putting more poison into the person. And that poison causes cellular damage and pain, and also, a bit of an itch. And each person's reaction is different, but I don't know anyone who likes it. It does hurt. I've been stung thousands of times and it still hurts every single time. So the forager bees are the ones that go off to the flowers. They're the very important resource collectors, and their bodies are very specially made for this job. So you can see that honeybees are very furry. If you looked under the microscope, you would see that they have these branched hairs. And in fact, those act to have something of an electric charge, and it attracts the powdery pollen from the plants onto their fur. And you can see here, this bee is quite covered in pollen. And she has these pollen baskets at the back where she's able to brush her hair and pack it in there. But all the while she's visiting flower to flower, she's doing her service as a pollinator while she's collecting food for her family. So how does pollination work? Well, a bee will visit one flower and collect pollen, and then she'll go to the next flower and some of that pollen will fall off. And that's exactly what the flower needed to get the boy parts and the girl parts together so that they can make seeds, which are really baby plants. So this is super important. And honeybees are managed and multiplied and traveled around the country specifically for pollination. The best thing about honeybees as pollinators is that they love large sets of flowers. They don't want just like one yellow flower here and a red flower there. They're into yellow, 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 yellow all day long, which is very beneficial to the plant because then the proper pollen is being brought to them. So here's what the pollen basket looks like on a close-up. You can see it's an empty basket here. Then the bee will fill it, fill it, fill it until it makes this big pollen ball. And she gets that at these beautiful large fields of flowers. So this is a field of sunflowers, which they absolutely love, or it could be an orchard of apples. But these monocultures, which are very common in agriculture, are perfect for honeybees because they like to go to the same flower over and over, use them all up before moving on to the next flower. So this is what makes honeybees great for agriculture. Now, one last thing I want to tell you about is one of my favorite things about honeybees, and that is that they can communicate with each other with an actual language that humans can understand. They're the only animals that do this. And so what they're doing is they are telling their nestmates that there's something really good somewhere, and here's how you get there. So it could be food, usually food, or if the colony has swarmed and they're trying to find a new hive, they may communicate that way. But either way, they're communicating specific information about how far away this resource is, what direction to go in to get to this resource, and how excellent is this resource. Is it so-so, or is it the most delicious, energetically awesome food ever? And they communicate that. So how do they do that? Well, you're going to remember that bees do everything on the wax comb. Remember, it's parallel combs, it's standing upright in the hive, and it's dark, completely dark. So this is a bee doing a dance on the vertical comb in the dark. And basically she is wiggling her butt here, then going around to the beginning, wiggle, 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 back to the beginning. Now the direction of that waggle portion, that wiggle, wiggle part, is what's giving all of the information. So the length of the waggle, physically and in time, both are telling the distance to the resource. And the angle of that on the comb is telling where the flowers are. So in this example, if you think that straight up in the hive is equal to go to the entrance of the hive and go straight toward the sun, this bee is giving a resource that is on a 20-degree angle to up. And so when they go to the entrance, they're going to say, okay, there's the sun. I'm going to go turn 20 degrees to the right and go in that direction for the distance that I was told, and I should find the flower. It is so amazing. And there are people that specialize in looking at the dances and figuring out where the bees are going. Now, I also told you that it's going to tell something about how good the resource is. So this bee will be telling her sisters how it tastes and how it smells by what's on her body and by the taste that she will give them. And also her waggle, that wiggle part, is going to be really energetic if it's awesome, and really kind of boring if it's so-so. So here's a couple of more examples. If I was giving you a test, I would put these on here and I would ask you, you know, which food are they communicating with this dance? And you would be like, oh, look, 45 degrees to the right of upright is 45 degrees to the right of the sun. So the food must be over there. And that's what the bees are doing all day long. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I hope that you love honeybees as much as I do. They are very important managed pollinators that beekeepers tend very carefully. They're super fascinating. Like I said, I've been studying them for 25 years and I will never learn everything, ever, ever. I'm a lifelong learner, always learning new things. And I hope you have a better appreciation for how the colony works and how these bees have to cooperate and bring home food for you.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. I really liked that the girl bees are the worker bees and that the bees communicate so much detail with a waggle dance. That's absolutely amazing. So let's have you answer some questions from the audience. I'm going to start with a question about, are honeybees native insects to the United States and Pennsylvania?
They are not. They came from Europe and Africa, and they actually traveled on those ships, like with the Pilgrims, for example, because they wanted to have some sweetness for their cooking when they got here. So they brought them over here, and then they spread from there by swarming and moving into trees and things.
So when they're swarming and they're in an area, there's a reason for that. So my neighbor once had a swarm in their yard. Why does that happen when you see the bees swarming?
That is the way that the colony reproduces. So if they're in a hive and they've filled it all up, they're busy bees. They don't want to just sit back and relax. They're not like, oh, we have enough, we'll just not work anymore. They want to work. So if they feel crowded, they're going to take half of the worker population and the queen and leave and find a new home. And what they leave behind is half of the worker population, all of the larvae. And that colony then can make its own new queen within about a month. So it's taking one colony and making it into two.
That's interesting. So what would happen to the bees if the queen dies then?
Well, in either case, if the queen dies or if the queen leaves with the swarm, they can make new queens, because if you remember how I told you that workers and queens are both made from fertilized eggs, they're both fed the same food for the first few days. So if eggs or very young larvae are available in the hive, they can just switch over some of them and make them into queens rather than workers by giving them more room and more food and extra special care. It's really fun and it's really cool to watch.
That's crazy. What amazing little insects. So there's a couple questions about the flavor of honey. And I have heard this, depending upon what the bees, where they're spending their time affects the taste of the honey. Is that correct?
Yep, the honey flavor is totally based on what they've been collecting. So if you go to the store and you see a specialty honey that specifically talks about one plant, that beekeeper had to very carefully place their bees in the right place at the right time and then remove the honey. So that's all they had. If you see something called wildflower honey, that's our code for I have no idea.
Well, that's what I was kind of wondering. How do you know exactly where the bees have been? So they
Most
do.
people,
Go ahead.
Beekeepers know their area. They know what flowers are available. They know the seasonality. So they're, doing their best guess. It's probably not 100% just that plant, but it's like mostly that plant.
There's an interesting question about, you talked a lot about the outside of the bee and what the bee looks like. What does the inside of a bee look like? Do they have organs similar to humans, or are they very different?
Great question. They're quite different from us. They do have organ systems, so they have a digestive system very similar to ours, except that I wonder if you've been wondering how they carry nectar, because it's not on their outside of their body, it's on the inside. They actually have a series of stomachs, and the first one is the honey stomach. So they'll fill that, and then when they get back to the hive, they regurgitate the nectar. So it's kind of like throw up, and then their digestive system continues from there. But what's really interesting is that they have an open circulatory system. So, we have, a heart that pumps blood through our veins, and that's bringing oxygen and nutrients all around our body. Well, theirs is just like an open cavity with like blood sloshing all around, and it doesn't carry oxygen. So the oxygen system is a series of veins, but it's literally air goes inside of them down through the veins to bring the oxygen. So yeah, insects are very different from us.
Interesting. There's a few questions specifically about beekeeping, and one of them is, have you ever used a flow hive, and are they worth getting, and are they safe and efficient?
For most beekeepers, we think of a flow hive as like sort of a fun novelty. It works, but you should, if you would like to have a flow hive, you should learn beekeeping first, and then you can add a flow hive into what you're doing as your hobby. Because you can't just throw bees on there. Like, you don't want brood in those particular parts. That's only for honey. And so you need other things underneath so that the bees are making their, more workers and things like that.
And for those of us who don't know what a flow hive is, what is a flow hive?
So if you saw my white boxes, we stack them on top of each other. So the ones that are just for honey are on the top. We call it a super. You can get a flow hive super, where they're gonna, they fill in these special hexagon cells, and then to harvest the honey, there's a crank on the outside that like cracks the cells open, and then the honey flows out a tube. So it's a really innovative, cool thing, because most of the time we have to take that box home, we have to cut the wax cells off, we have to spin the honey out. So it's like a different way of getting to the honey.
So maybe a little more efficient for the humans, not necessarily for the bees.
If you have just a couple of hives, I think it could be fun.
Well, speaking of handling the hives, one of the listeners saw that you were handling the frames without gloves. Do you get stung?
Yeah, so to me, those big rubber gloves that you see people wearing, usually they're just in the way. I can't feel what I'm doing, and the fingertips are always too long, and they're getting stuck in things. So pretty quickly, I just like abandoned those and went with my bare hands. And I think I do a better job. I'm more careful with the bees. If I do get stung, like I have this rule of like the same hand gets stung 5 times, I'm done. And I put on nitrile gloves, like the doctor kind.
Yes.
That just protects me just enough, but I can still feel what I'm doing. And they come in all these great sizes so that the fingers fit right. And so that's my, if I have to, thing that I do.
That's good. Well, you mentioned Dr. Gloves. So are there veterinarians who specialize in taking care of bees?
Up until a few years ago, we did not need veterinarians for anything in beekeeping. We're able to diagnose and treat all the problems on our own. But a few years ago, they put in a special law that if you need antibiotics for anything, especially if they're ones that we humans use, you need a veterinarian's prescription. So now veterinarians are really trying to learn beekeeping so they can be the ones that we call if we need an antibiotic. I'm not saying there aren't veterinarians that have always had that as their hobby. They probably have. But for the most part, your learning about beekeeping has to include diagnosing and treating all of their problems all by yourself.
What are the greatest medical issues that you would have with bees?
Well, the worst possible problem is a bacterial disease called American foul brood. It's highly, highly contagious. It can be in hive equipment that's been stored for 100 years and still be infective. And that disease is the reason that we have in Pennsylvania required registration of your hives and also an inspection program. So there are 7 people whose job it is to go visit beekeepers and peek in their hives and make sure they don't have this bacterial disease. And if they do, it's like all hands on deck. We need to look at every hive in the 2-mile radius. And the only way to get rid of it is to burn. You dig a hole, put your whole hive, all the honey, all the bees, all the equipment in there and burn it. It's very horrible, horrible disease. Yep.
Well, you talked about the different cells in your presentation, and one of the listeners wants to know the difference. There are the birthing cells in a different location from where the honey cells are.
Oh, really good question. Any cell can technically be used for anything. So, but yes, generally the bottom, so on these hives behind me, the bottom like 3 boxes would be what we call the brood nest. So in there would be a sphere of brood and then a little bit of pollen outside of that and then honey outside of that. So they keep all the brood in this brood nest. And since honey's on the outside, it also can go up, 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 up. So that's kind of, they have like this brood sphere and then some pollen and then honey all on the outside of that. And that's why this is so convenient for us. You know, we can keep adding boxes on top, on top, on top, and they'll just make honey in all of those sections. So yes, they do keep them separate.
So there have been a lot of reports in the news that the bee population is in trouble and declining. So what can people do to help this?
So first I want to clarify that when you hear about the Save the Bees campaign, it's really honestly not about honeybees. As you know, I told you honeybees, you know, are not from the US. They don't really need our help. There are beekeepers taking care of that actively. But what really does need our help are the native honeybees, not native honeybees, because there aren't any, the native bees. So bumblebees and, you know, orchard bees and these little solitary bees that nest in those straws or in the ground, they are having trouble because they're losing habitat. So if you want to help honeybees and or native bees, the most important thing you can do is plant flowers everywhere and do not use pesticides on them. So just providing habitat and food is a number one.
Thank you to the audience for your questions. If you want to explore more about this topic, you can visit Penn State Extension website or the State Museum of Pennsylvania's website. The links are in the chat box, along with Dr. Underwood's contact information. She did want you to know that she will be away for a few days. So if you do send her a question, she may not get to it right away, but she will get back to you as soon as she can. So Dr. Underwood, before you go, what would you like the audience to remember from today's program about honeybees?
They're the most fascinating organism ever. And even though they sting, they're still really sweet, nice creatures. And if they did sting you, they didn't really want to.
Well, I would believe that. They provide a lot for more than just themselves. So they are much appreciated. So thank you so much for sharing this and for being part of this program today. So
yep, and one last thing.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I encourage you to buy your honey directly from a beekeeper or at a farmer's market. I assure you, I promise you'll even like the flavor better than what you're buying in the grocery store, and you're helping a small business. So
that's a great recommendation. Are there any programs going on at any of the Penn State campuses or through the extension that people can find out more about?
We do have a Beekeeping 101 online class that you can do at your own pace. You know, I would encourage people to look up a local beekeeping club, and they may be doing something right where you live. So also, I don't know if you've ever heard of Ag Progress Days. That is in August every year at Penn State, and we'll be having a beekeeping education table there, and including demonstrations where you can go into a hive and see all this stuff for yourself. So maybe you want to come out to that.
Oh, fantastic. That sounds great. Again, you can find out that information through the links that are in the chat box for the web pages. Thank you again, Dr. Underwood, for being part of this program.
Thank you.
I hope the audience will join us again for our Learn at Lunchtime program. Visit the website for program information and to sign up. Today's program was recorded and will be available on the PHMC YouTube page.